Thank you all for coming out today. I think you're a good group. Keep in mind, I work with 17-year-olds, so after about 4 minutes, I have 4 minutes to make my point, and then they're looking at their phones. So you guys are a captive, wonderful audience for me. And I want to say, too, that those of us, and many of you, can be included in this as researchers and people who study and think deeply about these issues. Coming to having an invitation to come and speak about this is a real privilege. Many of us spend many hours alone by ourselves thinking. So to be gathered here amongst tribal members, I might say, is a real privilege. I'd like to thank Lance and the organizing committee for the invitation to speak. And I'd also like to thank the ancestors, as Terry did this morning, in guiding us to this place, because this is the topic today, or my topic, on the dead. I was in Cape Town giving a different paper last year, and I stood up, and this was like day 3 of the conference, and I stood up and I said, I really want to thank the ancestors for including all of us and extending the invitation, and all of the electricity went out. Everything, the lights, the slides, and we were in a dark room. And I said, wow, I should have thanked them much sooner because this is not so good. And we got everything running again, and it was fine. And it never did it again. It was just that moment. So there was something about the acknowledgement of the ancestors that was very important. So our topic today is Carl Jung, Active Imagination, and the Dead. And I wanted to just tell you briefly how I got into finding Jung, or a very Jungian statement is how Jung found me, okay? And I was teaching Latin at the time. I was very involved in teaching the Aeneid. Has anyone read Virgil's Aeneid? Okay, Peter, well done, Peter. It is a story about a hero. It's an epic. And this hero has terrible problems all the way through the story. The first part of the story, Troy collapses, and he turns around and he sees his deceased wife in a ghostly form. And she says to him, you must go. You have a destiny. You must pick up your son and your father, and you take the survivors, because you are destined to found a great new city. Now, we know that city is Rome, okay? What will become a great city. So he does this, and he has many adventures, one of which is to land in Carthage and fall in love with Dido, who is a disaster of a partner. So he has to leave her. In the process, his father also dies. And he kind of comes to the end of his emotional reserves. He doesn't know what he wants to do. And just when he's at his lowest point, he looks up and he sees a vision of his father in ghostly form. And his father says to him, come to the underworld. I want to talk to you. Now, that line in the Aeneid stuck in my mind for almost 20 years. I could not figure out why. If he had made the connection with his deceased father, why did he have to go somewhere else to talk to him? What was it about that message that necessitated book 6, which is the watershed book, where Aeneas goes to the underworld to speak to his father? So I'd been working on this and working on it. And my husband said to me, you know, you should really do a PhD on this, because you've been thinking about this for really a long time. And so I found this wonderful supervisor, and I said, this is what I'm thinking. This is what I think is going on with Aeneas. This is why I think the father appeared, and then he had to go to the underworld. I'm not quite sure what the underworld is, where the underworld is, but there's something important here. And so he said, read Jung. Read the Night Sea Journey, understand the dark night of the soul, and try and see the underworld as the unconscious, okay? And as soon as I started reading Jung, I actually left that meeting with him, and on the flight home, I read Memories, Dreams, Reflections. How many of you have read that? Okay, good. We've got a good crowd here. When I read MDR, my first thought was, why is Jung talking so much about the dead? What is it about him and the dead? Because he keeps mentioning dreams of the dead, appearances of the dead. So this was aligning nicely with me. So I read this Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and I thought, well, I'm going to have to get to the bottom of this. One of the episodes in the first part is that his father died in January 1896. And 6 weeks later, he has 2 dreams of him, 3 days apart. And the dream, as Jung describes it, is suddenly he stood before me and said that he was coming back from his holiday. He had made a good recovery and was now coming home. Now, I thought this was very interesting because Aeneas too lost his father, and he had a vision of his father, and his father told him to come see him in the underworld. So I was thinking, this is an interesting parallel. But what I want us to do today is to look at the way Jung describes these experiences, because there are clues in the way he's describing his material that tell us that he is having a very specific experience with the dead, with his dead. And so what I'm hoping is our project today is that I can hopefully build for you a case that the dead for Jung was a very specific kind of interaction, psychic interaction, than other material. And we'll get into this. So he questions, right after he has the second dream, he questions, so what does it mean that my father returns in dreams and that he seems so real? Now, this is a very, very different question to why am I dreaming about my dead father? And this way that Jung's describing this cued me that he was having a very specific interaction. He was not having a dream about his father. He was seeing his deceased father. Okay? So what I thought we could do briefly is I'd like to give you a timeline of what was going on with Jung about this time and up to his confrontation with the unconscious, when he had his most intense series and connections with his unconscious content. And if you've seen, I brought the red book for you. It's on the table, so please stop and have a little look at the end of our talk. So, November 1896, Jung is 21 years old. It's about, let's see, his father died in January, so it's that many months later, same year. He gives a series of talks called the Zofingia Lectures. He belonged to a student society, and this group got together and talked about academic questions. And it's in this talk, a series of 4 talks, where he raised the idea of the immortality of the soul. And the reception of these talks was tepid. People were surprised because they knew him to be a very intellectual and a very sound thinker. And they were quite surprised that he was bringing this kind of material to the discussion. Not only was he was surprised by their reaction, but he was also quite despondent. He couldn't figure out why he could have a dream like he had that felt so real, and that he couldn't convince his colleagues that there could be this possibility, even though physics wasn't necessarily supporting this at the time. Couldn't there be a possibility that ghosts are real as we experience them? Couldn't there be a possibility that my father did return? I wasn't just dreaming about him, but something else was going on. So in November 1896, he gave those lectures. Between 1899 and 1900, he started attending seances with his cousin, Helle. Now, something we want to keep in mind, too, is that Jung's mother, Emily, was also quite psychic. Jung talks about her having this kind of dual personality, and one part was herself and the other part was quite uncanny, and that he could walk into the room and know which one was operational at the time. He could tell, oh, she's in her number 2 personality. Now, her father was also very psychic, and he was a pastor, as well as Jung's father. So this is interesting, repeating occupations in a family lineage. So he would have his wife stand behind him while he was writing his sermons so that the ghosts wouldn't interrupt his flow of thought. Okay? So this is a lineage of interesting behavior. And also you want to keep in mind that in Switzerland about this time, this kind of, there wasn't Netflix on a Saturday night, so let's go to the seance. This is what my cousin's doing, and let's go see what's going on with her and who she's talking to, right? Maybe talking to her grandfather who was part of this family. So he attends these seances, and this really captures his imagination. Let's just go out another concentric circle and say about this time, everybody was watching mediums. William James had a medium. William James, the psychologist in Boston, he was studying a medium. Freud had a medium. Flournoy, who is a French psychiatrist with whom Jung studied, he was studying a medium. And so this was buzzy in the psychological and professional circles of the time, okay? In 1902, he's at the Bergolzi Psychiatric Hospital working, and he does his doctoral dissertation on his cousin. Okay? This dissertation was very well received. He writes down narratives that she told him during her seances, and also narratives on what she thought was happening during these seances. And he comes to the conclusion that mediumistic behavior is a bit odd. That's what he concludes, that it's a bit abnormal, and that it must be the personality of the medium that seems to be eliciting this odd behavior, okay? So he passes just fine. He becomes a psychiatrist with that information. A few years later, in 1907, he meets Freud. Very, very famous meeting. He and Emma travel to Vienna and meet Freud for the first time. They talk for 13 hours straight. Part of what Jung was interested in talking to Freud about was what he thought about the occult and parapsychology, or these events that occur. Freud wasn't, he had heard so much about Jung. He was excited about the meeting. He wasn't necessarily excited to be this focused on parapsychology. And he was later to warn him, be careful of the black tides, the mud tides of the occult. And Jung never really understood Freud's resistance to this. So the meeting went very well, and it was the start to a really strong personal and professional relationship at that time. In 1909, Jung resigns from the Bergolzi. He had had 2 children there. His family was growing, and they were in residential accommodation in the basement of the hospital. And Emma said, enough's enough, come on, we need a proper family home. So he moves out of the hospital, and he resigns from the hospital. And in 1911, a few things happen. One, his cousin dies early. His cousin Helle, who he observed in the seance and about whom his dissertation was written. She dies, and he starts to publish the first of 2 parts called The Psychology of the Unconscious. Here was a blatant resistance and refute of Freud's psychology. The question was about libido. Freud said libido was all about repressed energy, mostly sexual, and Jung said, no. There is so much more going on in the unconscious. And libido is about the psychic energy that people use to become themselves. And if you focus on the libido and libido symbols and what is coming to you from the unconscious, that is the way forward for you to individuate, to become yourself. Freud didn't like this at all, and the tensions started to rise on this question. And professional tensions within the various circles, the Vienna circle of psychiatrists as well as the Zurich circles. And so this tension was arising, and Jung was feeling a lot of pressure at this time. So in 1912, Jung begins to have the first of what I call his death dreams. And these are 4 death dreams, I include the dream of his father in this series of dreams, because I think the dream of his father was so seminal in kicking off this question of immortality for him that it makes sense that these other dreams kind of follow suit. So he has these 4 dreams in which the dead appear. And they're not dead, they're alive, they're talking to me. Or I'm walking in a cemetery and I look over at stone knights. What do you call those? Where the knights are laying in stone? Tombs. Okay, and I looked over and suddenly the knight started to move, his finger moved. So there is this encounter he's having, and he's not understanding the symbolism of why the dead are returning at this time. He's not understanding it. So in 1913, this is a very big year. In 1913, in September, he has his last break with Freud, okay? It's the break with Freud, his last correspondence with Freud. Now, recently I read a book, a very good book that I highly recommend, that has given this time period a very different context. And the book is called Sex versus Survival, The Life and Work of Sabina Spielrein. And some of you will know this character from the famous movie, A Dangerous Method, yes? Now, this new research that's come out by a Jungian analyst, John Launer, out of London, paints a very different picture about the tensions that were enveloping Jung and Freud. And at the center of it is this young woman, Sabina Spielrein. She came as a patient, the Brigolzi, in 1904 and stayed there for a year. And Launer managed to get more access to different medical records and notes that Jung took of their sessions. And what he discovered was that she was very, very bright. She had a real talent for being able to see symbolic material. And as a part of their sessions, she came on psychiatric rounds with him, and he would ask her questions, and she would contribute her opinion. And meanwhile, she is a patient, a psychiatric patient. She left about a year later, cured, and Jung really encouraged her to go to medical school. He felt that part of her issue was all this mental energy and emotional energy that was unchanneled at that time. So he managed to get her into medical school. He wrote recommendations for her. But what happens, as we all know, is they fell in love, okay? And this relationship lasted on and off for several years, to the point where it became quite fever-pitched. Not only with Sabina actually expressing that she would really like to have Jung's child, with Emma Jung, his wife, writing to Freud saying, "This is really bad. Can you help me with this problem? You sent Sabina to Jung to be treated." And Freud writing to Jung saying, can we reframe this relationship? She is a patient. She came to you as a patient. And so John Launer does this research and paints this picture that not only were there professional tensions between Jung and Freud that were academic, but that this personal relationship with Sabina was causing a lot of very embarrassing problems for Jung, and that part of this tension that he started to feel and alienation had to do with this relationship. So, September, he has this official break with Freud. In October, he begins to have his first visions. Now, what you want to keep in mind is that these visions start sometime at the beginning of October 1913 and last absolutely every single day until about April, May of 2014, okay? The Red Book is the account of those visions as they happened and those conversations as they happened, and often dated, okay? Knowing exactly what day they happened. So what we have here, his first visions, I should say, in October, he had 3 times visions of seeing Europe covered in blood, okay? And he did not know how to interpret that. What we now know is that it was a prescient vision, because not, 10 months later, August 1st, World War I breaks out. He was actually quite relieved when the World War broke out. And he said, now I know what that was about. It wasn't about me. It was a global vision. Okay. So now, what Jung called this series of visions his confrontation with the unconscious, okay? And it was brutal, and it was abrupt, and it was, it just did not let up. So I thought what we could do, he describes this as a period of inner uncertainty, a state of disorientation. And his method was to consciously submit himself to the impulses of the unconscious. And in MDR, he describes, I let myself drop. I let myself drop down into this feeling of disorientation, of despair, okay? Now, what I thought we would do, I'm gonna go back. Okay, I wanna try an experiment with you. Now, you know how these things like sound really good in your mind and you kind of go through and you're like, no, this could be really good. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna treat it like an experiment and see what happens, okay? So what I'd like everyone to do while you're looking at me, I want everyone to picture what they had for breakfast, okay? So you're seeing me and I'm still talking, and now everyone is thinking and can see what they had for breakfast, whether you see it on the plate or it's in your hand. Is there anyone not there yet? Everyone can see their breakfast with your eyes open. You're very good. This is a very good group. Okay. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to do a kind of guided visualization for a few minutes. If you don't want to participate, that's totally fine. Keep your eyes open. If you'd like to participate, it would really help me with what we're going to do later, okay? So if you close your eyes, and what you're going to do is just listen to my voice. And just get comfortable. Just take a couple of breaths. And just feel yourself in the room. And what I'd like you to do is, in your mind's eye, I want you to look down and see your bare feet. And you see your bare feet that are standing on sand at the beach. And you feel and see the water, ocean water, lap over your feet. And you take note of the temperature of the water. And then you look up out into the ocean, and you're taking note of the weather. Is it a sunny day, or is it a cloudy day? What is the temperature like? And now I want you to just feel your feet in the sand, and I want you to just walk down the beach, just slowly, like you're having a walk. And up ahead, you see someone coming towards you. Just make note of who it is. You might know them, you might not know them. Just make note. And you're approaching each other, and then both of you stop. And I'd just like you to have a very brief conversation with whoever it is that you've met on the beach. And I'm just going to leave you with that for about 2 minutes. Okay, and just finish up your conversation with that person. Thank them for spending time with you. Just take a couple of steps back, and you're going to turn around and walk down the beach where you've come from. You're letting them go off in the opposite direction from where they came. And then come back to the place where you were standing on the beach. You can see the imprint of your toes in the sand. And then feel your toes on the sand. And now just feel your toes in your shoes. Okay, and wiggle your toes around in your shoes. And then when you're ready, just very gently open your eyes. Okay? And just come back to the room. Very gently open your eyes. And just move around a little bit in your seat if you need to. Just get yourself back into the room. Okay. Okay, let me ask you, how many of you didn't meet anyone on the beach? Doesn't matter, no problem. Was there anyone who did not have a conversation? Okay. Okay, a few people, that's...
Towards the end, anyway.
Towards the end, that's fine.
I needed more than 2 minutes.
I know, I'm terrible when it comes to timing. I teach, so I get through stuff, okay. So is there anyone who did not recognize who they were talking to? Total stranger. Okay, interesting. All right. Is there anyone who met someone who is deceased that you know? Okay, that you know, someone who is deceased. Okay, all right. Is there anyone who had a really difficult time just being on the beach? Okay. Okay, a couple of people, a difficult time. But for the majority of you, you were on the beach. You were feeling what you were feeling, okay? So this is a little cheating, and I'm going to tell you why we kind of cheated this. I wanted you to have an experience of active imagination as close as we could get it in this setting, okay? And so let's go to some of the definitions of active imagination. In its simplest form, active imagination is an imaginal dialogue, which you just had, most of you had. A conversation between the ego, the part of ourselves that we consciously recognize as I, and another part of ourselves, which we are less conscious of, an element of the personality that is imbued with unconsciousness and experienced as not me. So there's an objective quality to this. You know, most of you who had conversations on the beach, it was with things that felt a bit foreign, not you, okay? Now, Jung says about active imagination, it is exactly as if a dialogue were taking place between two human beings, because most of you would have been dialoguing with someone. Did anyone see an animal? Ah, were you dialoguing with your animal, or your animal, the animal that you... A person and an animal. And the animal spoke as well?
Sorry?
Did the animal speak as well?
Almost speak, but...
That's okay. The animal was there. And you, ma'am?
Oh, it's just my friend's pet. I was talking to my friend and the dog.
And the dog was there. Okay, interesting, yes. Same.
The person happened to be there with his dog.
With his dog, nice. Well, beaches and dogs, that all goes together, doesn't it? Okay. So the dialogue takes place with two human beings with equal rights, each of whom gives the other credit for a valid argument or a valid perspective, and considers it worthwhile to modify the conflicting standpoints by means of a discussion. And in this way, you strike a balance or you make a compromise. So Jung's idea, after doing active imagination for months and months and months, was that there was something to this process. Keep in mind, he didn't go looking for this process. He fell into this process, literally. Okay, that's really important to know, because his encounters with the dead were a byproduct of being in active imagination. He didn't go seeking the dead out in these spaces. That's really important, okay? So the other important thing was that he analyzed what could be going on. We said that these visions happened between October of 1913 and April, May, June of 1914. Jung worked on this book for another 16 years on the content of this book. This was the center of his whole model of how the unconscious and the conscious interplay. That model he gained from looking intensely at these fantasies, okay? So active imagination is about these dialogues, and it's about trying to reconcile that difference. And in active imagination, at the end of the dialogue, so he purported, is that the reason for the person to appear in the first place is they represent a position that your personality hasn't embraced. And by talking to it, you give it voice and it integrates back into your personality. Does everyone kind of get that? Okay. The dead don't do that, right? The dead can't integrate into your personality. You don't want the dead integrating into your personality. The dead are their own thing, okay? They're their own thing. Okay. So what I want to do is just highlight some defining moments in his material that show that when he said he was talking to the dead, he was not talking to figures of the unconscious that were a part of his personality. Now, I have to do a sidebar at this stage and say, this is not a popular Jungian opinion, okay? And Peter would advocate that. It is not a popular Jungian opinion because Jungians feel, most Jungians, that the world is the psyche. And that if the dead are in the psyche, then it's still a projection of you. I disagree with that, okay? And what I think was going on with Jung is that he was speaking to the dead, and he was speaking with figures of the unconscious, and then he had to go talk about it and lecture about it, and he had to figure out a way of reconciling. He couldn't stand up in his psychological circles and say, on Saturday nights, I go talk to the dead in seances. It's great, you should come. He was not saying that, okay? So, a couple of moments in his material, both in Memory Streams and the Red Book, show that he really was talking to the dead and not to other figures. So, the first one. When he talks about the spirit of the depths, he's talking about his number 2 personality. That number 2 personality he was able to see in his mother when he walked in the room and said, whoa, she's in her uncanny space. Okay, the atmosphere in the room here is really strange. She's in that space. So the spirit of the depths is his number 2 personality. And he called it a wise old man, that it's been with him forever, through lifetimes. And his personality, number 1, was the Jung who went to work and lectured and was a father and was a part of building a life in the external world. So here we're about 2 or 3 pages into the Red Book, and he says, the spirit of the depths was silent in me since I swayed between fear and defiance and nausea. I could not and did not want to listen to the depths. But on the 7th night, the spirit of the depths spoke to me. Look into your depths, pray to your depths, waken your dead. Now, this was an instruction from the spirit of the depths. Now, keep in mind, he's still disoriented. He can't find meaning in his external everyday life. So in the evenings, he's coming in, he's making himself drop, and this is what he finds, is this initiatory moment. And the reason this is such an important moment in his material is that up to that point, the Red Book is all narrative driven. It's a conversation between the spirit of the times, the spirit of the depths, and his soul and him. Just a conversation. As soon as he wakens the dead, it goes all IMAX. He starts seeing colors. He starts seeing weather. He starts seeing terrain. He's in a desert. He's on a mountaintop. He's in a house. He's in a castle. He starts seeing, he's experiencing passages of time within an active imagination. He's saying, it's morning. I sat there and talked until late afternoon. It totally changes. The whole nature of the Red Book changes after this episode, okay? And it is connected with the dead, and it is connected to his visioning faculty. And that visioning faculty is the place where I asked you to visualize your breakfast. That's where Jung is, sitting at the table where you had your breakfast, that you're able to see. That's the place where active imagination happens, okay? All right, the second defining moment, very important. One night, again, in an active imagination, he is in a house with a library. He grabs a book in the library, and he talks about the left side of the hallway and the right side of the hallway. And this is very, he talks about this in his commentaries, how significant the right and left side are. And he goes into the kitchen where there's a cook, and he and the cook have this conversation, and he falls asleep. Now, what do you think it means to fall asleep already in a meditation? In an active imagination? Like, he's conscious enough to know that he fell asleep. And what he's doing is he's going deeper away from the personal unconscious to the collective. Right when he falls asleep, what happens, this throng of dead, and he's hearing the sounds, it's flapping sounds, this throng of dead comes through the kitchen, and he says, oh my gosh, who are you? We're the dead. Where are you going? We're going to Jerusalem to pray at the Holy Sepulchre. Well, that's interesting, because the Holy Sepulchre, of course, is the site of Jesus' crucifixion and the site of the empty tomb and the site of the resurrection, okay? So we're talking about living after death. That's what they're going to pray, where they're going to pray. And so he says to them, can I go? This sounds fun. I want to go with you. Can I go with you to Jerusalem? I'm just sleeping in this kitchen. I want to go. And this person who's representing the group, Ezekiel, says, you cannot join us. You have a body, but we are dead. Now, the reason this is important is I feel that this episode informed all of Jung's future interactions with the dead. Suddenly, within his active imaginations, he could sense, when he was discoursing, the difference between talking to a figure of the unconscious that belonged to him and talking to a deceased person. Okay? And the third, this thing is like sticky, isn't it? A little sticky. Maybe I'm not using it. Okay. The third defining moment is in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And he says, quite early, I had learned that it was necessary for me to instruct the figures of the unconscious, those people on the beach that you talked to. I had to teach them what it was like to be them. Or that other group, which is often indistinguishable from them, the spirits of the departed. So this is such a big deal because he's admitting, listen, these forms, the dead and the figures of the unconscious, they're existing in the same plane, but there's a difference to them. But I'm going to call one group the dead, okay, and one group the figures of the unconscious. So a couple of things that are what we researchers call problematic, okay? And the problem with the dead is that they are often indistinguishable from figures of the unconscious, okay? They present in the same way. They show up the same way as the dead do. They talk in the same way. They use the same language, okay? And this is complicated. So how can you tell the difference? The one overriding distinction is that the dead as discarnate souls, as souls without bodies, as Ezekiel said, are not subject to the same dynamic of integration into the personality, okay, as figures of the unconscious are, okay? They are different. Why are they different? Because Jung was able, in those unconscious places, to see who was a soul, okay, and who was a projection, what they call a projection, which is your own material projected out to be reconciled, okay? Now, and we're going to have a wonderful talk in a bit about out-of-body experience, but there are a couple of other places that give us clues as to what Jung was thinking about in terms of this separate experience. And he wrote to a colleague on November 4th, 1945, to express concern over the health of a fellow analyst from Maine. This is after his heart attack. He has a heart attack in 1945. He's in the hospital for several weeks. And it was a near-death experience with an out-of-body experience. It was the whole thing, okay? And so he writes to his colleague and says, the soul seems to detach from the body pretty early, and there seems to be almost no realization of death. What follows is well nigh incredible. It seems to be an adventure greater and more expected than anything one could dream of. So looking back on his experience of his near-death experience and his out-of-body experience, he could tell in his own self the difference between his soul and his body. And dying for him was this detachment. So in 1947, again, he was writing about his out-of-body experience to a colleague. And he had, E.A. Bennett was an MD that was interviewing him. And he said, I am absolutely convinced of the survival of the personality for a time, plus of the marvelous experience of being dead. And this is what Peter described to us a bit ago. You know, this amazing, blissful experience. And when he came, he didn't want to come back. He didn't want to come back. He said, how can I go back to life when this absolute unity and bliss that I'm feeling and experiencing, my soul is happier than I've ever been. And he wasn't ready. And interestingly enough, during one of the visions during this time, and keep in mind, these visions are happening over a 3-week period, he sees his doctor. And he sees him in this, what's called a primordial form. And he looks at him and says, oh, he's going to die soon. He's coming to me in his primordial form. And for Jung, primordial form meant he could tell if you were going to die, if he saw you in that form. And the doctor says to him in this vision, sorry, you've got to stay. You have more work to do. And he said, no, I want to go, I want to go. And he said, no. And Jung says, you know, you don't look good. I think your time is numbered. And he didn't say anything. And then within the week or 2 weeks, the doctor died. So that was another instance of a prescient vision when he could tell what was happening next. Okay, Marie-Louise von Franz was one of Jung's assistants and carried on his work, and she has some wonderful, wonderful studies of her own. She helped Emma Jung write the Grail study, where they both wrote for several years about the Holy Grail and the symbolism of the King Arthur stories. She said, the dead live in such utterly different conditions as to make them, even though themselves unconscious material. So she's saying, when the dead leave, they too go into the unconscious. They are unconscious material, okay? So as to make them, even though they are unconscious material, unlikely and in a sense incompatible with other unconscious material to be integrated into the personality. So basically she's also saying those beings that we met at the beach, as long as you didn't know them as people, okay, that's actually a big caveat, those are projections of you and they eventually belong back into your personality. But the deceased who we meet on the beach and the deceased who we talk to, their messages are important, their interaction, the exchange is important, but they have their own lives as the dead. And those lives don't belong in your personality. And she continues, one can smell, so to speak, which dreams, visitation dreams, deal really with the dead, and which only with their subjective image or projection. But it is very subtle, and one needs to tread on very uncertain ground. Again, this is very problematic, because you're probably wondering, well, how can you tell? When someone shows up on the beach, how can I tell if they're dead or a projection? And what Marie-Louise von Franz is saying, and Jung is saying, is this is very difficult to tell, but you just know. It's kind of like, how will I know the person I'm meant to be with? Well, you just know. Well, that doesn't help. Okay, that doesn't help you find the person you're supposed to be with, does it? No criteria at all, right? There's a wonderful story that Marie-Louise von Franz tells. An analyst came to her and said, I have an analyst. She's a young woman who was engaged to a pilot who died. And she's had a series of dreams about this pilot. And I can't sort them out. And Marie-Louise von Franz looked at the series of dreams and said, these dreams are her projection. These dreams are the pilot who's come back to talk to her. These dreams are the deceased coming back. And the analyst was like, no way, no. No. She said, take them to Jung. Go, you've heard what I had to say, take them to Jung. Jung read the dreams and chose the very same dreams that Marie-Louise von Franz said. He said, these are projections, and where she's dealing with the symbol of the pilot, the symbol of her fiancé, and these are visitation dreams when there's no other explanation other than he has returned to speak to her. Okay? And it's a wonderful story that I think exemplifies that when you spend time in the unconscious, as Jung did, you get very savvy about who you meet there. And he became very savvy about what was going on there in unconscious spaces. And this is the last slide, a quote from a letter that he wrote later in his life. And he assures his correspondent, Pastor Pathlin, of the genuine experience of the post-mortem encounter with his deceased brother, but warns of the dangers of associations with the dead because it entangles the consciousness of the living too much in the transcendental state, resulting in unconscious and dissociation phenomena. And so basically, he's saying what Marie-Louise von Franz said is, yes, the dead appear. The dead appear to us in our dreams, and they appear literally and not necessarily symbolically. And when they do appear, you don't necessarily want to keep up that relationship in that way because we're incompatible. Okay, we're made of different stuff. And Marie-Louise von Franz tells a story about a dream she had of her father coming back to visit, very similar to Jung's dream of his father, and how she became very, very hot, almost feverish. And she said when she woke up, it was just too much to bear. And she interpreted that as being, we are too different. We are incompatible to necessarily maintain for a long period of time that connection. Okay? So that's kind of what I wanted to say today about all of this. And I hope that can you just go forward, because I just have my references for anyone who, these are the references that I used. But I wanted to walk through how there is this difference and that the material of the Red Book that he worked on for years and years and years, and in fact is not finished, it's not complete. The last page, he ends it in the middle of a sentence. And there's something very symbolic about that, because it's as if the work really was never done for him, was never really finished. And there was quite a bit of a struggle to get this book published, because the Jung family kept it in a vault for over 50 years. And the editor, Stephani, finally approached the family and said, we live in a different time now. I think people are ready to see what he went through during this very, very difficult time of his life. And he said 5 times in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, that material was everything. It was my whole psychological model. That was the prima materia of my life's work.